It was a cold evening in London. The fog rolled through the streets, creeping into the corners of the city like an ancient secret, wrapping every familiar landmark in an eerie haze. Dr. John Watson had returned to his flat after a long and tiring day at the clinic. The cases had been particularly grueling lately, and as he made his way back home, he could feel his body beginning to give in to the exhaustion. The familiar sound of his boots clicking against the cobblestone streets echoed in the night air as he trudged along, head bent against the wind. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about this evening, or so he thought. As Watson entered his flat, the warmth of the fire in the hearth welcomed him, momentarily easing the tension in his limbs. He was grateful for the quiet respite, though it was clear from the pile of papers on his desk and the scattered books that work had followed him home. He set down his medical bag with a sigh and loosened his coat, rubbing his tired eyes. There was a faint sense of unease in the back of his mind, a slight itch of forewarning that he couldn't quite place. He had long grown accustomed to the peculiarities of his life, especially since meeting Sherlock Holmes. But tonight, there was something different, something he couldn't shake. Suddenly, the stillness of the room was broken by the sound of a door creaking open. Watson glanced up, expecting to see his old friend Sherlock, whose presence was often felt even before he was seen. But the figure in the doorway was not Sherlock. It was a man, tall and angular, dressed in dark clothes that blended almost seamlessly with the shadows of the room. His face was partially obscured by a scarf, but Watson could tell that his eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on him. Watson stood motionless for a moment, unsure of what to make of the unexpected visitor. It was rare that anyone would find their way to his flat without prior notice, let alone at this hour. The stranger made no attempt to introduce himself or explain his presence. Instead, he simply stepped forward, his movements deliberate and precise. He seemed unfazed by the unusual circumstances, his eyes never leaving Watson's face. Without a word, the man gestured toward the chair by the fire and took a seat. Watson, ever the professional, remained calm despite the unsettling nature of the encounter. He regarded the stranger with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. He had seen enough strange cases in his life to know that something was amiss. But there was no immediate threat, and so he chose to remain silent, waiting for the man to speak. After a few moments of silence, the stranger leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Dr. Watson," he said, his tone carrying an edge of urgency. Watson raised an eyebrow. He wasn't accustomed to being addressed in such a manner. It wasn't that he minded. On the contrary, he was used to peculiar forms of address, especially when it came to Sherlock. But something about the way the stranger spoke piqued his interest. "You don't know me, but I know you," the man continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. Watson's instincts were immediately on high alert. The stranger's words carried a weight that suggested more than just casual knowledge. Watson's experience in the army, as well as his work with Sherlock, had taught him that people who said things like that often had motives, and those motives were rarely benign. The stranger then shifted in his seat, and Watson could feel the tension in the air grow thicker. "I have information that could change everything for you, Watson. For both of you," he said, his eyes flicking toward the door as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Watson's pulse quickened slightly. He had never been one to be easily swayed by the promise of information, especially when it came from an unknown source, but there was something in the stranger's demeanor that kept him intrigued. The man didn't look like a typical informant, nor did he appear to be someone who could be easily dismissed. "Who are you?" Watson finally asked, his voice steady, despite the sudden rush of adrenaline that coursed through him. It was a question that demanded an answer, and the man seemed to understand the seriousness of it. "My name is Richard Baines," the stranger replied. "And you'll want to listen to what I have to say, Dr. Watson. You'll want to know the truth about what's happening right under your nose." The name didn't ring a bell for Watson. He had no recollection of anyone by the name of Richard Baines. But the stranger's words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken promise. Watson was no stranger to secrets, and Sherlock had taught him, well in the art of unraveling them. But there was something different about this case, something personal. It was a cold evening in London. The fog rolled through the streets, creeping into the corners of the city like an ancient secret, wrapping every familiar landmark in an eerie haze. Dr. John Watson had returned to his flat after a long and tiring day at the clinic. The cases had been particularly grueling lately, and as he made his way back home, he could feel his body beginning to give in to the exhaustion. The familiar sound of his boots clicking against the cobblestone streets echoed in the night air as he trudged along, head bent against the wind. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about this evening, or so he thought. As Watson entered his flat, the warmth of the fire in the hearth welcomed him, momentarily easing the tension in his limbs. He was grateful for the quiet respite, though it was clear from the pile of papers on his desk and the scattered books that work had followed him home. He set down his medical bag with a sigh and loosened his coat, rubbing his tired eyes. There was a faint sense of unease in the back of his mind, a slight itch of forewarning that he couldn't quite place. He had long grown accustomed to the peculiarities of his life, especially since meeting Sherlock Holmes. But tonight, there was something different, something he couldn't shake. Suddenly, the stillness of the room was broken by the sound of a door creaking open. Watson glanced up, expecting to see his old friend Sherlock, whose presence was often felt even before he was seen. But the figure in the doorway was not Sherlock. It was a man, tall and angular, dressed in dark clothes that blended almost seamlessly with the shadows of the room. His face was partially obscured by a scarf, but Watson could tell that his eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on him. Watson stood motionless for a moment, unsure of what to make of the unexpected visitor. It was rare that anyone would find their way to his flat without prior notice, let alone at this hour. The stranger made no attempt to introduce himself or explain his presence. Instead, he simply stepped forward, his movements deliberate and precise. He seemed unfazed by the unusual circumstances, his eyes never leaving Watson's face. Without a word, the man gestured toward the chair by the fire and took a seat. Watson, ever the professional, remained calm, despite the unsettling nature of the encounter. He regarded the stranger with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. He had seen enough strange cases in his life to know that something was amiss, but there was no immediate threat, and so he chose to remain silent, waiting for the man to speak. After a few moments of silence, the stranger leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Dr. Watson," he said, his tone carrying an edge of urgency. Watson raised an eyebrow. He wasn't accustomed to being addressed in such a manner. It wasn't that he minded. On the contrary, he was used to peculiar forms of address, especially when it came to Sherlock. But something about the way the stranger spoke piqued his interest. "You don't know me, but I know you," the man continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. Watson's instincts were immediately on high alert. The stranger's words carried a weight that suggested more than just casual knowledge. Watson's experience in the army, as well as his work with Sherlock, had taught him that people who said things like that often had motives, and those motives were rarely benign. The stranger then shifted in his seat, and Watson could feel the tension in the air grow thicker. "I have information that could change everything for you, Watson. For both of you," he said, his eyes flicking toward the door as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Watson's pulse quickened slightly. He had never been one to be easily swayed by the promise of information, especially when it came from an unknown source, but there was something in the stranger's demeanor that kept him intrigued. The man didn't look like a typical informant, nor did he appear to be someone who could be easily dismissed. "Who are you?" Watson finally asked, his voice steady despite the sudden rush of adrenaline that coursed through him. It was a question that demanded an answer, and the man seemed to understand the seriousness of it. "My name is Richard Baines," the stranger replied. "And you'll want to listen to what I have to say, Dr. Watson. You'll want to know the truth about what's happening right under your nose." The name didn't ring a bell for Watson. He had no recollection of anyone by the name of Richard Baines. But the stranger's words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken promise. Watson was no stranger to secrets, and Sherlock had taught him well in the art of unraveling them. But there was something different about this case, something personal. With a sense of foreboding, Watson made his way to the designated location. The warehouse was situated on the outskirts of London, an imposing structure that had long since fallen into disrepair. The windows were boarded up, and the building seemed abandoned, but Watson knew better than to assume the place was empty. It was the perfect hideout for those who wished to remain unseen, and he had a strong suspicion that this was exactly where the answers he sought would be found. As Watson arrived, he was immediately struck by the eerie silence of the area. The streets around the warehouse were deserted, the only sound the distant rumble of horse-drawn carriages on the cobblestone streets. There were no signs of life, but Watson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every instinct he had told him to be on guard. Yet, he pressed forward, determined to learn more. He approached the entrance cautiously, his steps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the ground. The door to the warehouse was slightly ajar, and Watson pushed it open slowly, his heart racing in his chest. The interior was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the floor as the light from a few flickering candles cast an unsettling glow. The smell of stale air and old wood filled Watson's nostrils as he moved further inside. He heard a noise from the far corner of the warehouse, a soft, scraping sound, as though something heavy was being moved across the floor. Watson froze, his body instinctively tensing as he listened closely. The sound continued, and then a figure stepped into the dim light. It was Baines. His expression was serious, his eyes scanning the room as he carefully observed Watson's every movement. "Close the door behind you," Baines instructed, his voice low but firm. Watson complied, shutting the door quietly and taking a step forward. He didn't ask questions. He knew better than to do that in situations like this. There was a time for answers and a time for action. Baines motioned for Watson to follow him deeper into the warehouse, and Watson obeyed, his curiosity growing with each step. They passed stacks of crates and barrels, the air thick with dust and the remnants of old shipping labels. Everything about the place felt abandoned, as though it had been forgotten by the world. But Watson knew that appearances could be deceiving. They reached a small office tucked away in the back of the warehouse. The door creaked as Baines opened it, revealing a room filled with maps, papers, and strange objects. The walls were adorned with diagrams, each one meticulously drawn, showing intricate networks of connections. Watson's eyes darted from one diagram to another, trying to make sense of the patterns that seemed to emerge. It was clear that Baines had been working on something important, something far more complex than Watson had anticipated. Baines gestured for Watson to sit at the small wooden desk in the center of the room, and Watson did so without hesitation. He was eager to understand what was happening, what Baines had uncovered. The man's intensity was palpable, and Watson could tell that this was no ordinary case. This was something much larger, something that had the potential to unravel everything Watson thought he knew about the world. Baines sat across from Watson, his eyes never leaving the doctor's face. There was no need for pleasantries now. Time for small talk had long since passed. "We're getting closer," Baines said, his voice steady. "Closer to uncovering who's behind all of this." He paused for a moment, his gaze turning cold. "But the closer we get, the more dangerous it becomes." Watson nodded, his mind racing as he tried to piece together the information that had been presented to him. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he wasn't about to back down. He had made a promise to Baines, and to himself, that he would see this through to the end. "Who are we dealing with, Baines?" Watson asked, his voice tinged with urgency. "Who's behind all of this?" Baines leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he met Watson's gaze. "That's the question," he said, his voice low. "The people we're after. They've been operating in the shadows for years. We don't know their names, not yet, but we do know that they're powerful. Very powerful." He paused again, as though choosing his words carefully. "And they've been manipulating everything, the economy, the government. the very fabric of society itself. Watson's heart skipped a beat as the gravity of Baines's words sank in. He had suspected that there were powerful forces at play, but to hear it confirmed was something entirely different. He had always believed that the problems of the world could be solved with enough determination and effort, but now he wasn't so sure. "Who's in charge?" Watson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Baines didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and walked over to one of the maps on the wall. He traced a line across it with his finger, stopping at a specific point near the center of the diagram. "This is where it all begins," he said, his voice thick with tension. "This is where the threads of this network meet. But the person who holds the strings, they're elusive. We've only caught glimpses of them, but they've been watching us the entire time." Watson frowned, trying to make sense of the puzzle that was slowly unfolding before him. "And what's our next move?" he asked, his mind focused on the task at hand. Baines turned to face him, a grim smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We find them," he said simply. "We follow the trail until we uncover their identity. Once we do that, we can take them down." For a brief moment, Watson felt a surge of adrenaline. The thrill of the chase was something he hadn't felt in a long time. But as quickly as the excitement came, it was replaced by the weight of reality. He knew that this would not be an easy task. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, and there was no telling how deep the conspiracy ran. Without another word, Baines motioned for Watson to follow him. They left the small office and made their way back to the main floor of the warehouse. The silence around them seemed to close in, and Watson could feel the tension in the air. They were on the verge of something big, something that could change everything. But as they stepped out into the night, Watson couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch out, lurking just beyond the edges of his vision. Baines led Watson through the dimly lit streets, his steps swift and purposeful. They moved quickly, their pace matching the urgency of their mission. The city around them seemed to hold its breath as they walked, as though it too was aware of the danger that was lurking just beyond the horizon. As they approached a nearby alleyway, Watson's senses went on high alert. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he instinctively reached for the gun that was holstered at his side. Baines, however, didn't seem to notice the shift in atmosphere. His focus remained sharp, his eyes scanning the area as they moved deeper into the alley. It wasn't until they reached a small door at the end of the alley that Watson realized what was happening. The door opened with a soft creak, and two men stepped out from the shadows. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the unmistakable expression of men who had seen their fair share of violence. Baines didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "We need to talk," he said. The men exchanged a glance, then nodded, stepping aside to allow them to pass. As Watson walked past them, his pulse quickened. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but there was no turning back now. They were in this together, and whatever happened next, Watson knew they had crossed a line from which there would be no return. The night air was cool and crisp as Dr. Watson followed Baines through the narrow alleyway. The world seemed unusually quiet for a bustling city like London. The fog that had hung over the streets earlier in the evening had dissipated, but the stillness left an unsettling feeling in the air. Watson's mind was racing, though he kept his movements calm, the urgency of the situation never far from his thoughts. As they entered the door at the end of the alley, Watson could feel a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The air in the small, dimly lit room was thick with the smell of old wood and tobacco smoke. There were shadows everywhere, lurking in corners and beneath low-hanging beams, and for a moment, Watson felt like he was being drawn into a place where the world's rules no longer applied. Baines moved toward a small table in the center of the room, where several maps and documents were spread out in an almost deliberate disorder. He motioned for Watson to sit, and Watson obeyed, pulling up a chair next to the table. As he sat down, he glanced at the papers in front of him, his mind still struggling to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few days. Baines, standing at the far end of the room, turned toward Watson and met his gaze. There was an intensity in his eyes, a focus that belied the gravity of the situation they were caught in. Watson could see that the man was deeply committed to the cause, whatever that cause might be. It was clear that Baines had been working on this for much longer than Watson had realized, and that he had come to the conclusion that only the two of them could unravel the web that had been spun around them. "We're close now," Baines said, his voice steady. Watson looked up at him, his brow furrowing as the words settled into his mind. "We've uncovered more than I expected. They're closer than we thought, Watson." Watson took a deep breath, his mind shifting into a state of calm alertness. The mention of "they" sent a chill through him. He wasn't sure who Baines was referring to, but he had a sinking feeling that the answers were going to be darker than he was prepared for. "What have you discovered?" Watson asked, though he already had an inkling. Everything about this situation screamed conspiracy, and yet it felt far more dangerous than any case he had ever worked on before. Baines walked over to the table and began pointing to a series of names on one of the maps. Each name was circled in red ink, and Watson could see the connections between them forming a complex network, each line leading to another. It was a puzzle, one that Watson had been trying to solve ever since Baines had shown him the first set of papers. "They control everything," Baines said quietly. "The people behind this are not just powerful, they own everything. The city, the government, the law. They've set up a system of control that runs so deep we've barely scratched the surface." Watson leaned in, his attention fixed on the map. He could see the extent of the web that had been laid out before them. It was like watching a spider build its trap, meticulous, calculated, and hidden from view. It was a system built on secrecy, and Watson knew that finding a way to untangle it would not be easy. "I still don't understand," Watson said, his voice filled with frustration. "Who are they? What do they want?" Baines sighed, his eyes flickering, with something that resembled regret. "We don't know their names yet, but we know that they're everywhere. They're the ones pulling the strings behind the scenes, manipulating the course of events to suit their own agenda. They've been doing this for decades, Watson, and they're getting close to their ultimate goal." Watson looked up at Baines, his heart racing. He had heard of powerful men controlling the fates of nations, but this felt different. This wasn't about money or power in the traditional sense. This was about something more insidious, something that could change the very fabric of society itself. "What's their goal?" Watson asked, though he feared the answer. Baines paused before responding. "We don't know yet, but we're going to find out." The uncertainty of the situation was palpable, but Watson had already made up his mind. He had no choice but to move forward. There was no going back, not now, not with so much at stake. And, as much as he hated to admit it, he knew that Baines was right. They were the only ones who could uncover the truth. Before Watson could ask any more questions, there was a noise outside the door. A soft, almost imperceptible tapping sound like the lightest knock, followed by the sound of footsteps receding down the hallway. Baines stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "Someone's here," he muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. Watson stood up, his senses sharpening. He had been trained to detect danger, but he had never felt anything like this before. The bow, hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and his hand instinctively moved toward his pistol. He was ready for whatever was coming, but Baines had already moved to the door. With a quick motion, Baines opened the door slightly, peering out into the hallway. His face hardened as he scanned the area. There was no one in sight, but the air outside the door felt thick with tension. "This is bad," Baines said, his voice low but urgent. "They're onto us." Without another word, Baines pushed Watson back into the room, closing the door behind him with a quiet but forceful click. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice firm. "Don't make a sound." Watson didn't question Baines's command. He had learned to trust the man's judgment, even if he didn't fully understand what was happening. Baines had always been a step ahead, and Watson had no doubt that this was no different. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly. Watson's heart was pounding in his chest, and every sound, every creak of the floorboards, every distant footstep, sent a surge of adrenaline through his body. He didn't know what was going on outside the room, but he could sense the danger lurking just beyond the door. Then, just as suddenly as the tension had built, it was broken. Baines re-entered the room, his face set in grim determination. "They've set a trap," Baines said, his words clipped. "We have to move, Watson. Now." Before Watson could ask for an explanation, Baines grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the back door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Watson could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were running out of time, and there was no room for hesitation. Baines pushed open the back door, revealing a small courtyard hidden behind the warehouse. The moonlight illuminated the space, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Watson's breath caught in his throat as he noticed the figure standing in the corner of the courtyard, barely visible in the darkness. It was a man, tall and imposing, his features hidden beneath a dark cloak. The man's face was obscured, but his eyes glinted with a cold, calculating light. Watson instinctively took a step back, his hand gripping the pistol at his side. "Who is he?" Watson whispered, his voice tinged with alarm. Baines didn't answer. Instead, he moved forward, stepping into the courtyard with a quiet but purposeful stride. The figure in the corner didn't move, but Watson could sense the tension in the air. The man was waiting for something, or someone. Watson remained where he was, his instincts on high alert. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as though something monumental was about to take place. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the figure spoke. "Dr. Watson," the man said, his voice deep and smooth. "I've been expecting you." The words sent a chill down Watson's spine. There was something unsettling about the way the man spoke, as though he knew far more about Watson than Watson was willing to admit. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Watson realized just how dangerous this situation had become. The man stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to part around him. His presence was undeniable, and Watson felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over him. This was no ordinary adversary. This was someone who had been watching them from the beginning, someone who was always one step ahead. And then, in the stillness of the night, the man's eyes met Watson's, and the world seemed to stop. "You're too late," the man said, his voice like ice. "The game is already over." The words echoed in the cold courtyard, their weight settling like a heavy fog around Dr. Watson. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure's eyes bore into him, unblinking, as if they were peering into the deepest corners of his soul. The man's presence was overwhelming. There was an unnatural stillness to him that made Watson feel as though he were being drawn into a trap, a place with no escape. For a moment, Watson stood frozen, his thoughts racing. This was not just a man. This was someone who had been orchestrating events long before Watson had stumbled upon this mystery, someone who had known all along that Watson would eventually come to this point. The game, as the man had said, was indeed already over. Baines, standing just behind Watson, was the first to move. His hand went to the small leather pouch at his side, his fingers brushing over the concealed weapon he always carried with him. Watson didn't need to look at him to know that Baines was preparing for whatever came next. There was a certain coldness in his demeanor now. He had shifted from the man who had shared this secret world with Watson into someone entirely different, a person who was ready to act. The man in the shadows took a step forward, his cloak swirling around his feet. He moved with a calculated grace, his every movement deliberate, controlled. Watson's mind was working frantically, trying to process the situation, but the sheer presence of the man made it difficult to think clearly. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this felt different. There was something about this man that suggested he was no ordinary adversary. Watson's fingers twitched toward his own weapon, but he hesitated. There was something about the stillness in the air, the unspoken understanding between them, that made him think twice. He wasn't sure if pulling his weapon would make him part of the game, or if it would put him in even more danger. For a brief moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The man's lips curled into a small smile as though he were reading Watson's thoughts. Then, without a word, he raised his hand, and the courtyard seemed to darken even further. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally around him, and for a fleeting moment Watson thought he saw something moving just out of the corner of his eye. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Only the man standing in the center of the courtyard, still as a statue. And then, the man spoke again. His voice was low, almost too smooth, as though it were sliding through Watson's very being, crawling beneath his skin. "You don't understand, do you, Watson?" the man said, his words carrying a weight of finality. "You think this is about you, about Baines. But you're wrong. This has always been about something far greater than you, something far beyond your comprehension." Watson's breath caught in his throat as the man's words settled in. He could feel his pulse quicken, his chest tightening with a mix of confusion and fear. He had been dragged into something much larger than he had ever imagined, and the realization was enough to send a chill down his spine. Baines shifted slightly behind Watson, his presence a silent reassurance. But even his calm demeanor couldn't mask the tension in the air. The man before them was not someone they could confront head-on, not without more information, not without understanding the full scope of what they were up against. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a sudden movement, the man reached into the folds of his cloak and withdrew something small, an object that gleamed faintly in the dim light. It was a delicate, intricate key, one that seemed almost out of place in the rough, cold surroundings of the warehouse courtyard. The man held the key up, examining it for a moment before his eyes returned to Watson. There was a knowing look in his gaze, as though he had anticipated this moment long before Watson had even stepped into the courtyard. "This key," the man continued, his voice laced with a cruel amusement, "is the last piece of the puzzle. It unlocks the door to everything, to the truth that you've been so desperate to find. But be warned, Watson. There's no going back once you've opened that door." Watson's thoughts raced. What was the man talking about? What was this truth that he referred to? And what did the key unlock? Every instinct told him that this was a turning point. Everything that had led up to this moment was converging on the key, and Watson could feel the weight of it in his bones. For a brief moment, Watson considered what it would mean to confront this man, to attempt to wrest the key from him. But the danger was clear. This wasn't just a criminal or a rogue element. This man was part of something much bigger, a force that had been working in the shadows, pulling strings and influencing events for far longer than Watson had been aware. Baines seemed to sense Watson's hesitation, and he moved slightly closer, his gaze never leaving the man. The tension in the courtyard was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Watson could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the man's eyes flicked between him and Baines. "Do you think you can stop it?" the man asked, his voice almost taunting. "Do you think you can undo what's been set in motion? You're too late, both of you. The time for action has passed." At that moment, something shifted in the air, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere, like a crack in the foundation of the world itself. Watson didn't know what it was, but he felt it deep in his gut. It was as if the ground beneath them was trembling, shifting ever so slightly, and the realization struck him hard. This wasn't just about the key or the man in front of them, or even the conspiracy that Baines had been investigating. This was about something far older, something far deeper. Before Watson could speak, the man turned, his cloak billowing behind him as he took a step toward the far side of the courtyard. Watson's pulse quickened, and without thinking, he lunged forward, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. But Baines was quicker. With a swift movement, he caught Watson's arm, stopping him just before he could act. "Don't," Baines hissed, his grip tight. "He wants you to chase him. He's playing with you." Watson looked up at Baines, confusion and frustration mingling on his face. What did Baines mean? What was happening? The man had turned his back on them, as though he were already certain of the outcome. Watson felt a surge of anger, of desperation, but he didn't pull away. Not yet. "Why don't we play a different game?" Baines murmured, his voice barely audible. "We don't have to follow his rules." Watson glanced at the key, still glinting in the shadows, held loosely in the man's hand. The realization hit him hard and his eyes widened. The man wasn't going to give them the answer they sought. Not easily. Not without a price. But the key wasn't the answer. It was the beginning of the next step, the door they would have to open to uncover the truth. The man's form seemed to blur as he faded into the shadows, vanishing from sight in an instant. Watson was left standing in the courtyard, the stillness of the night pressing in on him, the unanswered questions hanging in the air like a suffocating fog. Baines's grip on his arm loosened, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. This wasn't over. Far from it. They had been shown the path forward, and whether they were ready or not, there was no turning back. The man had played his part, and now it was their turn. The game, in its final form, had only just begun. And Watson, for the first time, truly understood what Baines had meant when he said that they were too late, because the clock had never stopped ticking.